are there waiting for us. And people tell us, this is what's going to happen if you
Good evening, America. Welcome to the Inside Scoop. I am your host, Mark Levine. We are broadcasting live here from We Act Radio Studios right here in Washington, D.C., in Anacostia. If you want to call in, it's 202-889-9797. Lots of news in the news. The biggest news, I think, that happened this week was what happened in Egypt. And it was a surprise, I have to admit, that this is not something that I expected. I don't like to admit that, but it is true that I had no idea that this was coming. When the revolution in Egypt happened, now it's been a little more than 2 years. Well, let's talk about Egypt there. Let's just give the whole history because it's important to understand to understand what we're dealing with right now, what the Egyptian people are dealing with right now. You kind of have to know the history of Egypt. So Egypt was under British rule for a long time. They had their own king, but it was definitely under the control of the British Empire. And that king lasted well into the 1950s when there was a dramatic coup by a military leader called Gamal Abdel Nasser. And what did he do? He nationalized the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal, of course, is a very, very important shipping canal. There's actually only two canals in the entire world that go between continents. One, of course, is the Panama Canal between North America and South America. Okay, I know you people who are technical. Yes, there's a little portion of Panama that's part of North America that's south of the Panama Canal. Don't argue with me. Basically, it separates the two continents. It allows ships to go between one continent and another. And So that's one of the two canals. And the second canal, of course, is the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal separates what is Africa from what is Asia or Asia, Arabia. And of course, that allows shipping between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. You don't have to go all the way around the Horn of Africa. The point is that the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal are uniquely important canals. Anyway, the British and French built this canal. Of course, they basically took Egyptian soil to do it. But this military leader, Abdel Nasser, did a coup, got rid of the king, took control, nationalized the Suez Canal, I believe in 1950s. Promptly, I know he had several wars with Israel. Israel invaded the Sinai, so forth. Anyway, after him came Anwar Sadat, also a dictator, but at least a dictator we could work with. The dictator who actually made peace with Israel in 1979. Still not the greatest dictator towards his people, but probably somewhat better than Nasser, although Nasser was pretty well loved. After Sadat came Mubarak. That was Sadat's vice president. Mubarak ruled Egypt for, well, pretty much ever since Sadat's assassination, I think in 1980 or so about 30 plus years. And Mubarak was the classic American supported dictator. In other words, he mostly did what we wanted. He had a cold peace with Israel. He took Egypt out of the Russian orbit and brought it into the United States and tried to make it part of the U.S. Basically a U.S. Supported government, and basically did what we wanted. In return, we gave Mubarak tons of aid. In fact, we've been giving Egypt more than $1 billion in aid for some 30 years now. Franklin Delano Roosevelt once famously said about another dictator, Anastasio Somoza, our dictator in Nicaragua, he said, yes, he's a bastard, but he's our bastard. And perhaps no one exemplified that more than Hosni Mubarak. He was a bastard, but he was our bastard. So he did all kinds of things America wanted, took Egypt out of the Soviet orbit, brought them into American orbit, kept at least a cold peace with Israel, and largely kept Egypt from becoming, a communist supported state like Syria actually was, or a crazy genocidal state like Libya or things like that. Well, Gaddafi became genocidal later on. I don't want to say he was genocidal while he was in power, but he put it this way. Mubarak was not the worst dictator in the Middle East. He was not the best. He was, as I say, ours. So Mubarak ran a country in Egypt that was dirt poor, that remains dirt poor, that is the largest Arab country, some 80 million people, mostly living very tightly close to the Nile River. And he was brutal. He was cruel. He wasn't a Saddam Hussein or a Muammar Gaddafi, but he certainly put political opponents in jail, and he repressed the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, which began in Egypt, I believe in the 1920s or 1930s, it's been around a long time, was a group of Muslims who disagreed with their government and supported a theocracy, supported an opposition to the Egyptian government that was based on the Islamic religion. Now, the point of all this is that most of the Arab countries, if you look at the Arab Spring, if you look at Libya or Tunisia or any of them for that matter, Bahrain or any place there's been an uprising, you find two very unappetizing choices. Two groups of people that, as American liberals, we hope neither wins. One is a secular, brutal military dictatorship where the military rules, where there's corruption, where there's authoritarianism, where people are thrown in jail if they disagree with the military, where human rights are not protected, often the rights of women and certainly the rights of gay people are not protected. A place where Christians are barely tolerated. There's certainly no religious toleration, and what Jews are left are generally brutally mistreated. These military dictatorships are awful places, and yet the people that oppose these military dictatorships are often, I don't know if equally bad, but definitely not something that we as liberals should support. They are theocracies. They also mistreat women. In fact, they mistreat women worse than the military dictatorships because many of them require women to wear the hijab, to wear the headscarf, sometimes, as with the Taliban, even more extreme. They require women to cover their bodies head to toe in burqas. And if you think a burqa is a bad idea just indoors, imagine it in the hot Arabian heat where you have this big black blanket over you. I'm sure that it is stifling for the women. Again, if women want to wear the hijab, God bless them, or Allah bless them, just like women who want to wear a cross or a Jewish star or a crescent, or men who want to do the same. I am fully supportive. In fact, I've condemned the government of France when they try to prevent Muslim women from wearing the hijab. If it's voluntary, then it's part of religious freedom, and everyone should have the opportunity to practice their religion as they choose, as long as they're not harming anybody else. But where it is mandatory, it is oppression. No one should ever be forced against their will to practice a religion in a way they do not wish to practice it. And I believe that's true in the United States. I certainly believe that's true in the Middle East and around the world. So these Islamic movements, beginning largely with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, sometimes are more dangerous even than the secular military dictatorships. And we saw that with the Taliban. And we saw how extreme Muslim theocratic also dictatorships, because they're not any more democratic than the military, are also terrible. They're terrible to religious minorities. They're terrible to women. They're terrible to gay people. They're terrible to anyone who doesn't believe in that religion. I strongly believe in separation of church and state. So the Middle East is stuck between these two awful choices, between secular military dictatorships, oftentimes supported by the United States, and Muslim theocratic popular movements that are distinctly unfair to women, unfair to minorities. Now, there is a third group. It's the third group we all love to love. I know I do. The secular liberals, the people who go to college, that attend Cairo University. They're often young people, the shopkeepers, the ordinary people who, yeah, they're Muslim, but they don't believe in a theocracy. They don't believe in imposing religion on everyone else. And they don't believe in imposing a military dictatorship. They're ordinary people trying to live their lives. They tend to be the middle class. They actually tend to be more wealthy than the dirt poor who often support the Muslim Brotherhood. Instead of earning $2 a day, they might earn $200 a day. It's, not $200 a day. Let's say $20 a day. Definitely not $200 a day. The point is that they're the middle class, and they're struggling to have a fair government for everyone. And almost always, and this happened in Egypt, the third way is lost. What happened in the elections that elected Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president that was just removed in the recent coup, was The Egyptian people voted, and lo and behold, the top two candidates were the Muslim Brotherhood candidate and the military dictatorship candidate. Because, if you've heard the Rockets Caucus last hour, those are the two primary forces in Egypt. I guess it makes sense they would get the top two votes. So there was a runoff. And imagine if you are, like me, a secular liberal who believes that religious freedom should be protected, but there should be no theocracy. And you're an educated person and you go to Cairo University, and maybe you're a young person and you hate the military dictator, but you don't trust the Muslim Brotherhood. What do? Well, many Egyptians sat out the election. I mean, that's what you do. Many did who were not believers in the Muslim Brotherhood voted for him just to get a change from the military dictatorship. I mean, he only won 52% of the vote, Mohammed Morsi. And then he comes into power. And Morsi was been in power almost exactly a year. In fact, I think he was deposed on the anniversary of his presidency. And he comes into power, and one of the first things he does is he bans demonstrations against him. He puts people in jail for disagreeing with him. He takes his political opponents, and he goes out against them. He stops independent journalists and people who would disagree with him. Well, that's the actions of a dictator. That's what a dictator does. So even though he was democratically elected, I have long argued, the United States has long argued, that one election does not a democracy make. A democratically elected leader is, as I said in the Rockets Caucus, is necessary to democracy, but it is not sufficient. A single election does not a democracy make. Many, many dictators got in power through a single election, including, I dare say, Adolf Hitler. He came into power in 1933 through an election, through a lawful election. The Nazis won a minority, a strong minority, I think it was 42% or so of the vote, and was put into office. And then, of course, he burned down the parliament, and that was the end of German elections. So a democratic election is not enough. The point is, I am not a fan of Mohammed Morsi. I'm not a fan of the way he ruled. And yet, I have real worries about the way he is removed from office. I'm going to talk about that when we come back. If you want to join in this discussion, I encourage you to do so. The toll-free number is 202-889-9797, 202-889-9797. This is Mark Levine. This is The Inside Scoop, and we'll be right back right after this.
You're listening to WPWC We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Does your child have difficulty controlling their anger or a history of academic failure in school? Options Public Charter School offers a therapeutic learning environment with small classroom sizes and on-site counseling services to help students succeed. Options PCS is now enrolling grades 5 through 11 for the upcoming school year. For more information, call Options PCS today at 202-547-1028. Options Public Charter School. Exceptional education for exceptional students.
You're listening to WPWC We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
All of us at We Act Radio are so proud of our neighbors here in Southeast D.C., especially one of our partners, the Ark. The Ark is at 1901 Mississippi Avenue Southeast. It's the home to some of Washington's best, including the Washington Ballet, the Levine School of Music, Boys and Girls Club, and the Children's Health Project. All provide a number of programs and services within the very same facility. The Ark is also home to the Ark Theater, the only theater east of the river, which hosts a variety of dance, music, and theatrical shows each year. Almost everything you could want is at the Ark, so stop by and see them. The Ark, 1901 Mississippi Avenue in Southeast. For more information, visit the Ark's website, www.thearkdc.org, or call 202-889-5901. The Ark, part of Southeast D.C.
You're listening to WPWC, We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Mark Levine. If you want to dial in and join this discussion, please do so at 202-889-9797. 202-889-9797. If you want to listen to this discussion and maybe you're driving out of range of We Act Radio, just go to my website. Go to marklevinetalk.com. You can hear me broadcast live every Sunday from noon to 3, and you can also check out my other shows. I have shows virtually every day of the week right there at marklevinetalk.com. Including my nationwide syndicated show that I do with Leslie Marshall called, of course, The Inside Scoop. You'll want to check that out as well. You can also follow me on Twitter at Mark Levine Talk. And again, I don't care whether you agree or disagree with me. I do encourage you, though, to have your voice heard and give us a call. 202-889-9797. So getting back to Egypt here, we have Mohamed Morsi. And what can I say? He is not the perfect leader in the world. There's a wonderful article in today's Washington Post by Robert Kagan, where he describes all of the problems that Morsi had, and let me read to you some of those, just so you can get the idea. As Kagan points out, he was the opposite of a Mandela, that's for sure. Look at a guy like Nelson Mandela, recently died, of course. Barack Obama was just down eulogizing him at his funeral. And Mandela grew up in apartheid. He grew up in enormous oppression. And yet when he came to power, Mandela didn't use that power to punish the white oppressors that had so oppressed the South African people. If he had, and I'm sure there was a lot of support for him doing so, because there was some brutal oppression under apartheid. But if he had simply turned it into, well, kind of what Robert Mugabe did in Zimbabwe, where the black people drove the white people out, then you just have, well, the people who were oppressing the people who used to oppress, and then it goes on and on and on, and it never ends. What Mandela did is he reached out, even to the horrible people who had oppressed him, and said, let's all live together in one South Africa. And although South Africa has its problems, his experiment has largely succeeded. And I actually have little doubt that South African democracy will last for a long time based on what Mandela did. He, in many ways, is the George Washington of South Africa, because rather than taking all the power to himself, he understood that you set up democratic institutions that will last long after he's gone. Much like our George Washington, rather than becoming king, decided to set up institutions that would last long after he was gone. So the point that Kagan's making is that Mandela is no Morsi. He writes, he ruled not so much as a dictator, but as a majoritarian. In other words, he had a majority, but he took it to create something very close to absolute rule. He imposed restrictions on the media. He excluded the opposition from important constitutional decisions. He actually pushed through a constitution that highly protected the Muslim Brotherhood, and basically he was an incompetent ruler. He points out some of the incompetence that he did economically and with, of course, the troubles in Egypt. All of that's true. But, as Kagan points out, just because it's true doesn't mean that this coup is something to be celebrated. If you have a bad president in a democracy, what do? You vote him out in the next election. That's how it works. And even though I happen to like the people who did the coup better than Mohamed Morsi, I think Mohamed al-Baradei, for example, is someone tremendously respected, secular, liberal leader. They were going to make him temporary prime minister. Apparently, the Islamists who supported getting rid of Morsi, a more conservative group called the Salafists, who are more Islamically radical, more supportive of theocracy, even than the Muslim Brotherhood, they opposed Mohamed al-Baradei because he was a secular liberal. So, but my point is that the people who got rid of Morsi, it was not just the military, including, by the way, ironically, the military leader, the general, a guy by the name of Sisi, the general appointed by Morsi himself, was part of it, along with Mohamed al-Baradei, the former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, along with a whole group of secular liberals, along with some very conservative Islamists, along with, let's face it, millions of people, including some 22 million who apparently signed this petition to remove Morsi. If that's true, and, I don't know who's checked the petitions, but if that's true, that's more people than elected him in the first place. And maybe the answer is, much like we have impeachment in the United States for a president that goes too far wrong, there should be a way to recall a president. Maybe that's the answer in Egypt. There are certain states, California comes to mind, though I know it's not the only one. Wisconsin comes to mind, where if enough people sign a petition, you have a recall election, and you can vote to remove from office someone you put in office. Had that been in place in Egypt, then maybe we wouldn't have had this coup. Because clearly there was a lot of popular support opposed to Morsi. All you have to do is look at Tahrir Square, look at those pictures from Cairo, look at those, I'm sure there are more than hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people. And they were there, and they were cheering, and they were glad to see Morsi go. And that includes people who oppose theocracy, secular Muslims. It includes Coptic Christians. It includes women who don't want a theocratic rule to take away their rights. So that's all good. And all those people, I'm glad, were out in force. And yet, it troubles me the way they took power. It has to. How can it not? They took their power in a coup. Now, admittedly, coups happen often in dictatorships, and it certainly would not be the first time in Egypt. But even if these are good people, and even if they're taking power after an incompetent and largely becoming authoritarian, democratically elected leader, the problem is not so much the people who want to take power. The problem is the process. If good people can take power by coup, bad people can take power by coup. And if the change in government occurs only by coup, then we're never going to have a democracy in Egypt. So I advocate using economic levers, using United States aid as the way to influence future Egyptian governments. I'm going to explain how that works when we come back. If you want to call in, it's 202-889-9797. 202-889-9797. This is Mark Levine. Follow me on Twitter at Mark Levine Talk. My website is marklevinetalk.com, and I'll be right back right after this.
listening to WPWC, We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Take Action News with David Schuster, Saturdays from 12 to 3 on We Act Radio, 1480 AM, and weactradio.com.
Well, for me, it's always been, you report the facts. You report like hell, let the chips fall where they may. And the truth ultimately is what's going to sort of help our society and help all of us. I don't think progressives want a thumb on the scale on the facts. They just want the facts out there. You let the facts out, and progressives will tell you, we're going to win 70% of the time. You may quibble with the percentages or whatnot, but I think that's just sort of what progressives are looking for, and I think that's where this all sort of meshes with my interest as a journalist. And my interest as a journalist is report the facts. Here's what's going on. Here's what the facts say. Here's what history says. Here are the lessons we know we have learned. And let people draw their own conclusions. And I think what's so unfortunate right now in the world of broadcast media is I do think that a lot of conservative radio, certainly conservative television, they're not interested in facts. And that's ultimately where I think conservative media is going to have its downfalls, that Americans are hungry. They're just hungry for basic information, hungry for basic facts. You report like hell, you let the chips fall where they may. I think it's natural for all of us who care, who are passionate about politics, who feel like we have a sense about the difference between right and wrong. I think it's okay to let that be part of your coverage. It's important for all of us as broadcasters and journalists. In this day and age, we have to be authentic. You can't be the person who's up in the ivory tower that comes down and tells people, now you must eat your peas. No, it's all about, we all have personalities, and I think it's being aware sometimes of our own bias, but also being open to the idea that sometimes we're wrong, but we have a dialogue, and we have a passionate dialogue, and we care about this country, we care about this community, and I think that sort of passion is what carries us through.
Hear more from David Schuster, Saturdays from 12 to 3 on Take Action News on We Act Radio, 1480 AM, and weactradio.com.
I'm Gary Johnson, former governor of New Mexico. Last year, my state became the 12th state to allow medical use of marijuana by patients who are seriously ill. Some people were surprised that a Republican governor supports medical marijuana, but I'm hardly alone. Groups like the American College of Physicians, American Nurses Association, and American Public Health Association have all acknowledged the medical value of marijuana. New research about medical marijuana is coming out almost every day, showing remarkable potential in all sorts of serious conditions, including cancer, AIDS, and chronic pain. But some in government still want to put politics and ideology ahead of public health. To learn more about medical marijuana and what you can do to help, contact the Marijuana Policy Project at 1-877-JOIN-MPP or visit them on the web at mpp.org. Thanks.
You're listening to WPWC, We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Mark Levine, talking about Egypt. We're going to get to some other topics in just a few minutes. We've been a request to talk about Trayvon Martin. I will happily do that, though I'm not sure what to make of the trial. I'll give you my thoughts on that in just a few minutes. I also want to talk a little bit more about the rulings on the Voting Rights Act and marriage equality law, because I think those Supreme Court rulings are something that are going to be remembered for decades. And also, I want a comment on the immigration bill. It's going to surprise you to know that I agree partly with George Will, conservative George Will. Now, he and I don't agree on much, but when he says that spending $46 billion on a fence just to increase the rate of apprehension from 84% to 90% across the Mexican border, I agree. I'd love to see that $46 billion spent on confronting poverty or homelessness or education or frankly, lowering the cost of student loans, or I could think of any other numbers of very good things that $46 billion could do. including helping to acculturate immigrants. If that's your concern about new immigrants, I certainly don't think a border fence increasing the rate of capture from 84% to 90% makes any sense at all, except, I guess, as a campaign pledge for certain Senate Republicans. So, Trayvon Martin, Supreme Court rulings, immigration, all coming up. But right now, I do want to finish my discussion on Egypt and encourage you to call in on that topic at 202-889-9797. Because to me, what's happening in Egypt is a microcosm of what's happening in the Arab world. And really, to some extent, to American foreign policy at large. We've always had these difficulties. I remember when I grew up in the 1980s, the question was communism. And in Latin America, there was a choice. We either had brutal dictatorships, military dictatorships supported by the American government in places like Guatemala and Honduras and Nicaragua, where these brutal military regimes would torture innocent people who were opposed to the government and killed thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people, supported by the U.S. government. As I said, the origin of the phrase, he's a bastard, but he's our bastard, is from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he was talking about the dictator of Nicaragua. But who opposed these groups? Popular uprisings supported by the Soviet Union, supported by Cuba, supported by communist dictatorships that also didn't have the well-being of the people in mind. They wanted to take power for their own purposes, to support their own brand of dictatorship, and to do their own brand of totalitarian murder and putting political opponents in jail. And that was our awful choice in the 1980s. And I remember many Republicans argued we need to continue to support these military dictatorships because as brutal as they were to their people, at least they were our friends. And many liberals opposed supporting these military dictatorships, but conceded that the alternative was not too appetizing as well. Just because we hated Somoza does not mean we liked the Sandinistas, or frankly, the communists in El Salvador, or Honduras, or Guatemala. And it was a very difficult thing. Should the United States be on one side or the other? Many argue we should just stay out of it. But neither group was out to help the people. Interestingly, with the fall of communism, we've seen better governments in Central America. We have seen how in Nicaragua, for example, you have a government that is neither communist nor a military dictatorship. There is a third way. And believe it or not, that third way also exists in the Arab world. As I said, the Arab world is not between military dictatorships and communists. It's between military dictatorships and people who support Islamic theocracy, who are definitely not pro-American. But more importantly, they're not pro their own people. They don't believe in government of the people, by the people, and for the people. They believe government of extreme Muslims, by extreme Muslims, and for extreme Muslims. And again, I don't care what your religion is. I don't care whether you're Muslim or Christian or Jewish or Buddhist or Hindu or have no religion at all. You should have an absolute right to practice your religion as long as it doesn't harm somebody else. But when you want a theocracy, when you want your religion to control all the manifestations of government, then that does harm other people. Then you aren't just practicing your religion. You know, I find that's true in the United States. People say, well, I'm Christian, I shouldn't have to accept same-sex marriage. Well, you know what? You don't. In your church, you can marry whomever you please. I don't care if your church marries penguins and dogs. Your church has the right to marry whomever you please. Many churches will say we won't marry two people unless they're both Catholic or both Unitarian. Well, probably the Unitarians aren't that strict. If they're not both Southern Baptist, or you don't raise your kids in our religion. Religions can even be racist. And as much as I would hate that, they have a right to do it under the First Amendment. Religions can say we only will allow these two people to join our church or these two people to get married. But you do not have the right to control the state. Southern Baptists have a right to say we won't marry gay people. But Southern Baptists do not have a right to say to the United States government, don't allow anyone, including non-Southern Baptists, don't allow any gay couples to marry. You see the difference? It always surprised me when people said, hey, you're intolerant of our intolerance. You're intolerant of Christianity if you don't allow us to control all the laws of the United States to force people to treat gay people as second-class citizens. If you don't allow us to persecute others, you're anti-Christian. And you're persecuting us. Well, you know what? I am tolerant of everything except intolerance. I'm tolerant of everything except harm to my fellow man or woman. I believe in the freedom to do what you please as long as you don't harm anybody else. But I am strictly intolerant of intolerance. That's right. I don't believe the Ku Klux Klan, they have a right to speak, but they don't have a right to control the organs of government any more than people who want to promote Christian law as the sole law of the United States, any more than the Muslims who want to promote Muslim law as Sharia law as the sole law of Egypt or Afghanistan or anywhere else. Or Jews who want to make Jewish law the only law of Israel. I'm opposed to them too, absolutely. Religions should allow freedom. Freedom to practice that religion is something I will defend to my grave. And freedom from religion, I will also defend to my grave. You have a right to practice your religion as long as it doesn't harm someone else, and you have a right not to practice the religion. You have a right to have a government that treats everyone equally under the law. In Egypt, it's the Christians who are persecuted. In America, it's the Muslims. But either way, the answer is equality under the law. So don't tell me that you're being persecuted just because you can't persecute others. You never have a right to persecute. That is not intolerance. It is not intolerant to be intolerant of intolerance. Got that? So coming back to Egypt, the situation in the Arab Spring, much like the situation in Latin America in the 1980s, is we are stuck between these two monsters. The military secular dictatorships, oftentimes supported by the United States, but not always. Assad in Syria is a military secular dictatorship supported by Russia and Iran. Between that monster and the fear of an Islamic theocracy that mistreats women, that mistreats religious minorities, that mistreats Muslims who do not want to be as extreme as the government, mistreats gay, lesbian people. I hate them both, as I think should any true democratic-leaning person in the Middle East. Is there a third way? There is. And the best example of that, I think, is ironically in Libya. Ironic because Libya is often given as an example of anarchy, where it's a mess. Well, Libya still has a ways to go. But Libya has a government elected by the people that is neither a military dictatorship nor a Muslim theocracy. The government in Libya is a secular, liberal government. Is it imperfect? Sure it is. I mean, it doesn't have much power. Let's face it, the various militias that helped topple Muammar Gaddafi, with our help that I supported, still have too much power in Libya. Indeed, the CIA base that was overrun by a Libyan militia and led to the death of our ambassador and 3 other Americans in the Benghazi affair. That agency, that CIA base, inadequately defended though it was doing a very important thing. They were disarming the Libyan militant groups, the terrorist groups, the militia groups, so that the government would have more power. But let's focus just for a moment, and I realize it's just a wisp of optimism, but let's focus on the fact that Libya is neither controlled by a military dictatorship nor an Islamic theocracy. It's controlled by a pro-American, secular, liberal government. We don't even have that in Iraq, where increasingly Iraq is becoming a Shia, more theocratic government. And we spent billions in Iraq. I'm not so sure we have that in Afghanistan, where we have a corrupt guy there, Karzai, who's becoming much like the military dictators of old. But in Libya, where the people themselves did their own revolution with our help, with a no-fly zone, I think is the best hope for the Middle East. I could point to Turkey, a secular government that has existed for, 50-plus years? No, longer, 60, 70 years, as a Muslim to be sure, but secular state. Clear democracy. But Turkey is veering back in the other direction. Erdogan, the prime minister, and he's had a lot of people protesting him lately, Erdogan has been leaning more towards theocracy, more towards Islamic rule. He far from there, and Turkey is still a democracy, and I wish them well. In fact, one of the best things to show Turkey's democracy is the protests that occurred in Istanbul, because the people were out trying to say, Erdogan, you'd gone too far. The point is this. To the extent that we can support this third way, we should. And to the extent that we can do it without force of arms, even better. I do support force of arms in Syria, where 100,000 innocent people have been murdered. I don't support the Shia and military dictatorship that is Assad, that's murdering all these people. And I am afraid of Al-Qaeda coming in, the alternative, the Islamic theocracy alternative. I've often argued we need to support this third way, and Hillary Clinton agrees with me, and so does David Petraeus and our Joint Chiefs of Staff and our former Defense Secretary, Leon Panetta. In fact, the only people who appear to disagree with me, the only person, is Barack Obama. Although President Obama is slowly getting involved, I wish he'd done a lot more, a lot sooner. But in Egypt, the third way has yet to appear. In Egypt, the third way seems to be represented in the coup. Seems to be represented because in the coup were virtually all the factions in Egypt outside the government. So I still have a bit of hope. But the question is, what can we do about it in the United States? And the answer is that we condition aid based on the amount of democracy going on right in Egypt. We give Egypt $1.3 billion a year. Excuse me, we give the Egyptian military $1.3 billion a year. We give all of Egypt $1.5 billion a year. But 1.3 out of 1.5, or 7/8 or so, roughly, if you do the math, of that aid goes to the Egyptian military. I think it's time we spread that aid around a little bit. Support the secular liberal groups. Support people advocating, whether they be of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Salafists or the liberals or the military, but anyone advocating for a full, comprehensive, democratic Egypt that represents all factions. And if we use aid to say, if you have journalists in jail, we're going to cut aid. And I realize America looks bad because, we've put our own journalists in jail, occasionally, rarely. This is a whole nother issue. But nothing like what they do in Egypt or in these other countries. Let's use the aid as a barometer of democracy. And Egypt might just have a fighting chance. They may have no fighting chance at all, but without our help, there's no hope whatsoever. And I'm an eternal optimist, at least with regard to eventually people finding some kind of democracy. The number's 202-889-9797, 202-889-9797. When I come back, I want to talk about Trayvon Martin. I want to talk about the George Zimmerman trial. You remember what happened in Florida, the very famous case, infamous case of a guy out there with a gun in his waistband, I would argue looking for trouble. As he said on 911, these guys always get away. Found a young black man, 18 years old or so, armed with nothing but a bag of Skittles, and shot him dead, and is now on trial. My comments on the Zimmerman trial, maybe it should be called the Trayvon Martin trial in honor of the victim, not the perpetrator, when we come back. If you want to dial in, it's 202-889-9797. 202-889-9797. This is Mark Levine. This is The Inside Scoop. We'll be right back right after this.
Listening to WPWC We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Friends, David Schuster here, and all of us at We Act Radio are so proud of our neighbors here in Southeast DC, especially one of our partners, the Ark. The Ark is at 1901 Mississippi Avenue Southeast. It's the home to some of Washington's best, including the Washington Ballet, the Levine School of Music, Boys and Girls Club, and the Children's Health Project. All provide a number of programs and services within the very same facility. The Ark is also home to the Ark Theater, the only theater east of the river, which hosts a variety of dance, music, and theatrical shows each year. Almost everything you could want is at the Ark, so stop by and see them. The Ark, 1901 Mississippi Avenue in Southeast. For more information, visit the Ark's website, www.thearkdc.org, or call 202-889-5901. The Ark, part of Southeast DC.
Hello, this is Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and I want to tell you about my new favorite discovery, Yosemite National Park. I recently went there with my husband and children, and we walked the trails to see the breathtaking waterfalls, admired the grand meadows, and giant sequoias. But the future of our national parks is uncertain. Many challenges face our parks today, from polluted air and water to development threats outside their borders and inadequate funding to protect our national heritage. That's why the National Parks Conservation Association recently completed a decade-long assessment of the challenges facing our national parks, along with proposed actions that will ensure our children and grandchildren will be able to enjoy the parks as we have. Our national parks have inspired Americans for nearly 100 years. As we approach the centennial of the National Park Service in 2016, please join us in helping to protect our national park legacy. Find out how at www.npca.org.
You're listening to WPWC We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Mark Levine. The Trayvon Martin trial has definitely transfixed the nation. I know I call it the Trayvon Martin trial, and I know, of course, it is the trial of the person who has admittedly killed Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman. So I guess I should call it the George Zimmerman trial. I guess I've always felt that murder trials should focus on the victim and not the perpetrator. It's unfortunate that they do. So pardon me if I call it the Trayvon Martin trial. But in a murder case, unlike really almost any legal case in America, both sides don't really get representation. Sure, there's a prosecution and there's a defense. But in a conflict between two people, and there clearly was the conflict between George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin that fateful night, in a conflict between two people that's not based on violence but based on a court of law, both sides usually get representation. In virtually every civil trial, you will see plaintiff and defendant both up there, both telling their sides to a jury, and then the jury decides who's telling the truth and awards damages. That's how our legal system works. Murder trials are unique, and I want you to think about this. In a murder trial, the murderer, or perhaps I should say the alleged murderer, definitely gets to tell his side of the story. He may or may not choose to take the stand. Could be a she. Most of the cases involve men. But the murder defendant may or may not take the stand, but definitely has a chance to tell, I'll say his, because in this case it's a his, has a chance to tell his side of the story. The murder victim, no chance at all. The murder victim does not get to speak. Whatever happened between Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman that night, we will hear George Zimmerman's story. We will not hear Trayvon Martin's. The only chance Trayvon Martin had to speak at all is a distant voice, a distant scream, heard on a 911 tape. That witnesses disagree about whether he or not it was him that was screaming. In very poignant testimony, the mother of Trayvon Martin got up on the stand and said that those poignant cries were her sons, Trayvon Martin, screaming, crying for help, perhaps his last dying gasps. And that's pretty powerful testimony until George Zimmerman's mother got on the stand and insisted that those same distant, virtually unintelligible cries were George Zimmerman. That he was the one crying out for help, and thus justifying his claim of self-defense. One of the women is wrong. I could say one of the women is lying, and it's possible one of them are, but lying, of course, implies that you know the truth and that you're intentionally telling something that is false. Sometimes two people can both think they're right, and one of them is clearly mistaken. We may never know who was crying for help that night, but we know that two mothers fervently testified under penalty of perjury that that was their son. Each one insists it was her son crying on the tape. So what happens in our legal system? What happens in our legal system is you give the benefit of the doubt to the murderer. I want you to think about that. We have a system of justice where you have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you're a juror in the if I were a juror in the George Zimmerman trial, I have to say I've been very skeptical of George Zimmerman's story from the beginning because I heard the 911 tapes. I heard where he said these guys always get away. I heard where the 911 operator said, "Are you following him?" And he said, "Yes." And the operator said, "We don't need you to do that. Go back to your car. Stop looking for trouble." I'm extremely concerned about a self-proclaimed vigilante taking his gun, patrolling his neighborhood, literally looking for trouble. Police officers do that, that's fine. They have training. And frankly, if they disobey the law, there is and should be very harsh penalties for police officers. But for ordinary people, this is exactly why I fear the availability of guns in Florida and in most states in the United States. It's why I fear the stand your ground law that's in Florida, because that law allows self-proclaimed vigilantes to feel justified in looking for trouble. I'm very skeptical of George Zimmerman. And in fact, I have to concede, I have not seen all the evidence at the trial. If I were a juror, I would carefully review all the evidence and only the evidence at the trial. I would not listen to anything outside the trial. That's our legal justice system. That's the proper way to evaluate the verdict in a courtroom. And if you don't like that, then take it up with the people who make the laws, deciding what evidence gets in and what gets out. If I were a juror, I would scrupulously ignore everything I'd heard beforehand, focus only on what's in the courtroom, and decide guilt only beyond a reasonable doubt. But I'm not a juror. I have heard the 911 tapes in full, and I'm convinced that George Zimmerman was looking for trouble that night. And yet, I don't know what happened. In fact, George Zimmerman may be the only man alive who does know what happened that night. He, God knows, has an interest in making himself look good. Either Zimmerman is telling the truth and Trayvon Martin attacked him, in which case he's telling the truth on the stand and he should be acquitted. Or he's lying and he attacked Trayvon Martin, and the fact that he was looking for trouble on the 911 tapes actuated itself in him actually killing an innocent person. But he's lying about it on the stand, and his defense counsel is lying about it. He hasn't taken the stand yet. He may never take the stand, but his defense counsel is trying to show reasonable doubt. I don't know whether Zimmerman's telling the truth or not. Again, I have my doubts based on the 911 tapes. I have my doubts. But even though I would probably find, just on the evidence that I've seen, I would probably find that Zimmerman probably killed Trayvon Martin. Probably is not the standard in a murder case. In a civil case, and many of you know I was a practicing trial lawyer for many years. In a civil case, the standard is pretty easy. It's called more probable than not. You want to know who wins a civil case? Whoever's 51% right, they win. I'm not sure who's right, but Guy A looks to be a little more right than Guy B. Guy A wins. That's how you determine a civil case. You can't decide between two people. Slight weight, you win. That's not how we determine a murder case. In a murder case, we only convict with proof beyond a reasonable doubt. If someone's probably guilty, we do not send them to prison. And that's a good thing, because we've decided that we'd rather have some guilty people go free than innocent people put in jail. So the stack is heavily weighted in favor of the criminal defendant. And if Zimmerman tells a story that could reasonably be true, even if I doubt that it happened, if it's a reasonable doubt, even if I don't think Zimmerman's telling the truth, if I have a reasonable doubt, a doubt based on reason, that maybe, just maybe, Trayvon Martin did attack him, I've got to acquit George Zimmerman. So here's my concern. My concern is I believe Zimmerman's probably guilty. And yet I believe that jurors could reasonably find him not guilty. Again, that doesn't mean he's not guilty. It doesn't mean he's innocent. If they find him not guilty, it doesn't mean he's innocent. But they might acquit him. They might find him not guilty because the prosecution has not made the case beyond a reasonable doubt. If you believe that Zimmerman is 95% guilty, but there's a 5% chance he's telling the truth, and it checks out and your doubt's reasonable, you probably should vote to acquit. So don't be surprised, ladies and gentlemen, if this jury actually acquits George Zimmerman, because that's the way our justice system works. And rightly or wrongly, I predict that's what's going to happen. Let me bring in Michael from the Bronx, who's been holding on a long time. And Michael, I'm sure you didn't like to hear what I just said, but that's my prediction. Go ahead.
Well, I'm glad you said what you said, Mark, because there are some revelations in the week's trial so far that you may not be aware of.
Okay, and I haven't seen all the trial testimony, so please inform me.
Okay, well, first off, I have to remind everyone that's following the trial that if you are going to follow the trial, like when you get home from work, your best bet is to follow the media outlets that provide the audio and video footage of the trial itself. Anybody, such as, can I mention a couple of media outlet names?
Sure, go right ahead.
Anybody like Fox News that is going to give a report on the Zimmerman trial without showing actual courtroom
footage,
right, cannot be relied upon.
That's true.
If they're going to rely upon the defense attorneys, who in my who I may say have been absolutely arrogant and unethical with the way they are handling this case and pretty much trash-talking the deceased with their press conferences and been caught in one lie after another, and just get video footage of people out on the street that might be on the same page as they are. No, that's not reliable journalism. That is not reliable reporting. I caution everyone not to fall for that garbage.
Well, luckily for us, of course, it's a jury who decides. It's not those of us who watch the media coverage. And that's why I pointed out that while I admit I have not seen every bit of the trial, I did listen to the 911 tapes, and I listened to all of them, and I listened to them completely, and because I wanted to hear the full context. I did not want to hear them taken out of context. And I told you, based on the 911 tapes alone, and that's all I've heard, okay? I haven't heard all the trial evidence. I saw the two mothers. But based on that, I believe George Zimmerman was looking for trouble. And yet I'm concerned, Michael, based on the way we try cases and based on the fact you have to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt and based on the fact that Trayvon Martin doesn't get his chance to testify because he's dead, I think that enough of a reasonable doubt might be there that this guy might get off. What do you think?
Can I raise some issues that
Please
might
do.
give
Please
you
do.
some ease on that?
All right.
Logically speaking.
Please.
All right. First off, I need to remind everybody, we keep hearing this. I don't know if I can call it nonsense, but I can't think of any other way of saying that the prosecution has the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But I got to remind everyone, this is not, I repeat, not your typical criminal prosecution case. It's not your typical criminal case.
Because it's one of self-defense.
No. A criminal case, period. Because the defendant did not enter a plea of not guilty. He entered a plea of not guilty by reason of self-defense.
Right.
Now, what is the difference between the two? If a defendant if a defendant says not guilty, he's saying, I did not commit such an action. You got the wrong guy. And, of course, he doesn't have to prove anything. The total burden then rests with the prosecution. But anytime a defendant enters not guilty by reason of whatever, the defendant is admitting to have committed the action he is charged with, but is claiming exigent circumstances, whatever that may be, and thus, under those exigent circumstances, should not be penalized for committing such a crime. In other words, saying that I would normally not commit this, but I was left with no choice. So, therefore, the burden does shift either partially or fully to the defense because they got to prove that they were justified in doing so, in doing the action that they did, which is normally the crime, the killing. The burden that the prosecution would have then is to disprove such a claim and remind the jury that the defendant himself admitted to committing this action when he pled not guilty by reason of blah, blah, blah. And we believe the evidence showed that there was no self-defense, that, in fact, it was just simple murder.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see exactly what the judge's charge to the jury is with regard to the law.
I'm afraid I'm glad you mentioned the judge, because I am afraid of that as well as to jury instruction. And I can only relate that to a different case that occurred in Albany. And I'm sure you heard of the Amadou Diallo case.
Of course. That's where the police in New York used I believe a plunger or a broom handle.
No. You think of Abner Louima.
Oh, excuse me.
Case. Amadou Diallo was the 41 shot victim.
Oh, okay. All right.
All right. The case was transferred out of New York City to Albany and got into the hands of a very pro-police judge, Joseph Teresi. And in the jury instruction, he imposed his own jury instruction and told the jury, you must judge this case from the police officer's perspective. And that's when the jury came back acquitting all those cops. And one of the jurors in question said to the press, well, basically the judge told us to acquit these cops through his jury instruction. So that I understand what you're saying, that it is a concern of what kind of jury instruction is given to these jurors.
And specifically, what's going to happen with the stand your ground law? Because you're right, Michael, that normally, so let's start with, and you make a very good point, because I pointed out that in general, The general rule is the prosecution has to prove its burden beyond a reasonable doubt. That's
Correct.
true, but as you pointed out, George Zimmerman has pretty much admitted, I don't know if he'll do it expressly at the trial, but I don't think anyone would doubt that George Zimmerman shot Trayvon Martin, that he pulled the trigger, and that his pulling the trigger made a bullet enter Trayvon Martin's heart and caused him to die.
And
So-
that's what got me so mad with people like Sean Hannity going on the airways saying there is no evidence proving that George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin.
Zimmerman had the gun. The bullet went from that gun. Zimmerman, I believe, told the cops he shot the gun. There's no dispute that Zimmerman shot Trayvon Martin. The dispute
And he
is...
admitted it through the doggone plea.
Right.
That's the key thing. I wish people would pay attention. And when he entered that plea, that's an admission that he committed the action.
That's correct. So
people,
the question...
please, don't fall for that nonsense.
So the question in the Trayvon Martin case is not who shot Trayvon Martin. We know who shot Trayvon Martin. It was George Zimmerman. The question is whether or not it was an act of self-defense. And you're absolutely right that in general the law in self-defense is that's an affirmative defense, meaning it's up to the defendant to prove his burden to show it was self-defense. But then there's a further wrinkle in this case that we haven't talked about yet, Michael, and that's the stand your ground law. And whether or not Florida's stand your ground law applies. And the whole purpose of stand your ground laws, which I firmly oppose, but the whole purpose of these laws is to say if somebody attacks you, you don't have to run away. You can basically shoot them, which I think is a ridiculous law, but it is the law in Florida. So the question is whether or not Zimmerman can prove self-defense, and then further or not whether he falls within the ambit of the stand your ground law. And frankly, I don't know whether he does or he doesn't.
It's funny you mentioned about stand your ground because that was an issue that was brought up. The thing is that initially Zimmerman had said in a videotape interview, and I'll get to these videotape interviews in a moment, he had said he had never heard of stand your ground, but a college professor of a criminal justice course was testifying by way of, I think, Skype is what they call it, and he was stating that Zimmerman was a straight-A student in criminal justice, and he knew very well about stand your ground because that was a course that was one of the topics in the course that was being taken. So there's another lie right there. I want to touch base also, Mark, about the stunt that the defense was pulling. Now, we already heard...
Tell you what, before you touch base on that, Michael, I want to take a quick break. I also want to give people a chance to call in at 202-889-9797. We'll be back with a discussion of the Trayvon Martin case. I guess you should call it the George Zimmerman case. This is Mark Levine. This is the Inside Scoop. On the line, I have Michael from the Bronx. We'll be right back right after this.
Listening to WPWC We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Hello, my name is Jim Gray, and I am a judge of the Superior Court in California and a former federal prosecutor in Los Angeles. I would like to talk to you for a moment about marijuana. Did you know that since the federal government first banned marijuana in 1937, usage in this country has actually gone up by about 4,000%? Or did you know that in the Netherlands, where adults are allowed to possess small amounts of marijuana and buy it from government-regulated businesses, fewer adults and fewer teenagers smoke marijuana than here in our country? Or that an American is arrested on marijuana charges every 38 seconds? If you are wondering if any of this makes sense, you are not alone. To find out more, contact the Marijuana Policy Project at 1-877-JOIN-MPP or visit them on the web at mpp.org. Thank you, and good luck to us all.
My name is Joe Thompson. I'm 29 years old and I have a career that I love as a systems analyst. Career. It still sounds cool to say that word. I never could have gotten on this path without a college degree. And if the college me were here, he'd tell you.
I never would have gotten to college without big brothers, big sisters. I could have ended up anywhere, on the streets even. But college? Joe Thompson? Not likely. My big brother helped me out. He taught me I could do anything, at a time when a lot of people were saying just the opposite.
And to a 7-year-old, that means a lot. My big brother's name is Phil. And Phil is the reason that this 7-year-old grows up to be a systems analyst.
Whether you donate money or time, you're helping Big Brothers Big Sisters help a child. And that can last a lifetime. Start something today at bigbrothersbigsisters.org. Brought to you by Big Brothers Big Sisters and the Ad Council.
You're listening to WPWC We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Mark Levine, talking about the Trayvon Martin trial. And it is interesting as a legal question, totally apart from the sociological interest. Obviously, what's bringing interest to this case is issues of race. Let's face it, Trayvon Martin was black and George Zimmerman was, I guess, white and Latino. What's bringing is the interest in a vigilante and, of course, the fact that he shot and killed an unarmed kid returning home with a bag of Skittles. But the legal questions are also, if anything, the heart of the trial. And probably what's on trial as much as George Zimmerman is Florida's Stand Your Ground law. What is the Stand Your Ground law? This is a law passed just recently by the Florida legislature that says that if you feel threatened, you do not have to run. You can actually attack. If you justifiably feel threatened, if someone attacks you, now you've always had a right to self-defense under the law. But the law said that if someone comes after you and you have a reasonable way to exit without attacking them, you had to leave the scene. The question is, does it apply to George Zimmerman, particularly since George Zimmerman admitted on the 911 tape that he was pursuing Trayvon Martin, at least at a point. He said these guys always get away. He said he looks like he's up to no good. I'm not sure why a black teenager looks like he's up to no good. At worst, it seems the worst thing that Trayvon Martin did is in these homes where a lot of them look alike in this development, and he didn't live there. He may have been confused over which development his uncle was in, and he was looking in various places. Or was it, maybe it was his stepfather. Correct me, Michael. Was it his stepfather, his uncle? You might remember who it was. Anyway, so the question is about this law. Should you be able to stand your ground? And the answer is that if you are looking for trouble, if you're instigating matters, then you cannot get the benefit of the Stand Your Ground law. But here's the problem. The problem is that Zimmerman claims that even if he was looking for trouble, that he went back in his car or was going back to his car and was not pursuing Trayvon Martin when Martin jumped out and attacked him. I find that implausible. But do I find it impossible? Do I find it beyond a reasonable doubt? I'm not sure. Michael, you've been hanging on a long time. I know you've got a lot to say. You go right ahead.
Yeah, well, actually, Mark, you find it, let's sum that up. You find it totally unbelievable, as I would find it unbelievable.
I find it implausible, but can I say for sure that it didn't happen? I don't know. I mean, I have to watch more of the trial. I find it unlikely.
That he went back to his car?
No, I find it unlikely that Trayvon Martin came out and attacked him. I find that really unlikely. The question is, do I find it untrue? The question is, I guess, the level of untruth. But but as you point out, self-defense is an affirmative defense. And if the answer is it more probable than not that Trayvon Martin attacked him, I say that's not probable. It's unlikely, and therefore Zimmerman's guilty.
And guess what? You're correct, because I can tell you, and I can lay it out based on what was testified and a certain coroner's report.
Okay.
All right? The thing is that throughout the timeline, you had Trayvon's friend that was on the stand that testified that she was having telephone conversation with Trayvon. Trayvon said there's some guy, when he decided that creepy bleep cracker, that is looking at him weird, and both he and the female friend, already I forgot her name, but it was a lady that did not want to be present and testify, and she was afraid of the defense. She was afraid of the the police, and for reasons already established, regarding the racial discrimination and what have you. But nonetheless, they initially thought Zimmerman to be some kind of pedophile freak. He was looking at Trayvon in a weird way, and then he started pursuing Trayvon. And Trayvon was asking the girl to stay on the phone with me. He was trying desperately to get back to his secondary home, where that was his father's girlfriend's place of residence.
That's right, father's girlfriend. Yes. Go
Right. And Trayvon was a regular visitor, so he was no stranger to the community.
Well, but he wasn't there often. I mean, the place is. My understanding is that this development has relatively identical houses, so it's not like
I understand, but it's not like it's not like Trayvon was there for the first time. That's what I'm trying to point out. Hello?
Yeah, no, go ahead. I hear you.
Okay. And the thing is that I need to remind everyone that this was a gated community. All right?
That's a good
Trayvon
point.
had every right to be within this gated community. George Zimmerman did not. He did not reside within the gated community. He resided outside of it.
Really?
So
No, I hadn't heard that before. I thought they both resided within the same gated community.
No. It was established even before the trial that Zimmerman's address was just outside of that gated community. He lived near it, but he had no affiliation within those gates.
But Michael, I know he was part of kind of a self-proclaimed neighborhood watch group that he helped organize. This, of course, is a wannabe cop. He wanted to be a police officer. He was refused admission to the police academy. But as I understand it, he was part of a neighborhood watch group that he himself helped organize. Did that neighborhood watch group regularly police within this gated community?
There's no report of that whatsoever.
Okay.
The only neighborhood watch came from Zimmerman himself that created this stuff. Before I go, because I know I'm trying to rush through some of it.
That's okay. We have time. We'll keep going, so don't worry. You'll get it all out. Go ahead.
Okay. Now, in terms of what the stunt defense did, they introduced a videotape interview of George Zimmerman with Sean Hannity. And Zimmerman was with Hannity. He was telling his story to Hannity, and the defense suspected that videotape interview to just sit with the jury.
Wait. The defense put that forward? I don't know that that's proper unless now again, I am an ex-trial lawyer. I've never tried law in Florida, so the laws can be different state to state, but my understanding is the prosecution could put in a defense testimony, a defense tape to show inconsistencies, but that the defense should not be allowed to do that unless Trayvon Martin takes the stand.
No, what happened was I think they introduced the videotape interview as part of a cross-examination against one of the prosecution witnesses. Nonetheless, the defense brought forth this videotape interview and played it for the jury.
I need to check and see why that was evidentially allowed.
It gets better than that.
Okay.
It gets better than that, and they pretty much opened the door to something they opened the door of Pandora's box they wish they never had. So here's Zimmerman giving an interview that's unsworn and no cross-examination, and I think the defense was counting on that to sit with the jury without Zimmerman ever having to get on the stand, be sworn in, and be subjected to cross-examination.
I just looked it up on the internet, Michael. The prosecution introduced that tape, and that makes sense. The prosecution could introduce that. I didn't think the defense could unless Zimmerman took the stand. So I'm right about that. The prosecution introduced the tape. Go ahead.
I stand corrected on that.
All right, go ahead.
But the prosecution also, and this was the part I was going to get to, they had introduced every single other videotape interview and presentation made by Zimmerman. We know that Zimmerman went on a media blitz to try to influence a potential jury pool, and each and every single video and audio clip, he was totally inconsistent with his accounts, that he kept changing the story one after another as to what had happened. So the thing is now, and this is why I say the prosecution backed the defense up in the corner, and they're not looking so cocky now as they did before, perhaps, that the thing is that either Zimmerman is going to get on that stand, be sworn in, and have to subject to perhaps a gruesome cross-examination, or he's going to let these video interviews and presentations sit with the jury, and the jury sees that this guy is changing his story and lying one after another, that he cannot be believed with the self-defense. Remember, part of that, part of the burden does rest with him and his team.
Let me say this. I think that's why the prosecution put forward that video. That sounds like a very good move for them strategically in the trial. They put forward the video because if Zimmerman does not testify, that'll be the only Zimmerman they hear. And let me tell you something. Every prosecutor I know worth their salt wants the defendant to testify. Because whether the defendant is innocent or guilty, the prosecution guarantee you they believe he's guilty. If they didn't believe he was guilty, they wouldn't bring the case because prosecutors have discretion to drop cases against people when they don't feel that the person's guilty. So the prosecution believes he's guilty. And every prosecutor I know, and I know a few of them, wants the criminal defendant to take the stand because they think they can trip them up in cross-examination, and often they can. In the vast majority of criminal cases, the criminal defendant does not take the stand. And under the Fifth Amendment, you have a right that will not be held against you. But I will say this, jurors, even though there's a clear, and there will be an instruction by that judge if Zimmerman doesn't testify, that you can't hold that against him, jurors want to hear the criminal defendant's story. And usually defense lawyers do not want their client to testify because they're afraid of what will happen on the stand. So 95% of criminal cases, and I've just made up that statistic, but the vast majority of criminal cases, the criminal defendant does not testify. And I'm not sure Zimmerman's going to testify here. But in fact, I'd bet against it. Go ahead, though.
He may not testify, but I got to remind you that, again, we have an unusual criminal prosecution case. He did not just plead not guilty.
That's true.
He pled not guilty by reason of blah, blah, blah.
Of self-defense.
And so the judge will have to give the jury an instruction regarding his plea, and not to a customary plea that the defendant not testifying is not to be held against him. That would be if the defendant just pled not guilty, but he gave by reason of.
And by the way, if the judge's instruction is incorrect as a matter of law, that's the clearest appeal that you can have. Of course, but the way it works, just so people understand, under the Constitution, if the judge rules in a way that's unfair to a criminal defendant and he gets convicted, he can appeal and possibly get his conviction reversed. If the judge rules in a way that's unfair to the state, let's say the judge doesn't correctly state the self-defense law, then he's acquitted and he goes free because under our Constitution, you can't have double jeopardy. You can't try a person twice for the same crime. So that judge may be corrected, but if the judge gives a wrong ruling, that defendant goes free. So it'll be very interesting to see what the judge issues as his law to the jury.
Yeah, and mind you that, George Zimmerman, if, just as you said, double jeopardy, he can't be charged twice for the same crime. He may not be off the hook because, remember, and everyone take note, the Justice Department, like you, I, and many others, they are monitoring this case also, and there could be a potential federal level of criminal prosecution.
It could be, but I just want to caution, Michael, the federal government has, in civil rights cases, they have gone out, particularly their cases in the South in the 60s, all-white jury fails to convict a white man accused of killing a black man, say in the Ku Klux Klan, or more recently in the case of Rodney King. His name escaped me for a moment. Was beaten by the cops because they argued that the cops who beat Rodney King violated his civil rights. So even when those cops were acquitted by a state jury, the federal government could prosecute. In the Zimmerman case, if he's acquitted, the federal government can only prosecute if they find a civil rights violation, and that's not easy to do. Just because Zimmerman was white-ish or white Latino, whatever, and Trayvon Martin is black, it's not enough. That does not in and of itself make it a civil rights violation. It's a lot easier to charge the police with civil rights violations, or frankly, to charge the Ku Klux Klan with civil rights violations, than to just charge a white guy killing a black guy. And unless you can show that Zimmerman was not just a vigilante with an itchy trigger finger, which I think he was, but actively racist and out to get Trayvon Martin because he's black, there may not be a second federal civil
I'm
rights
glad
case.
you brought that up, Mark, because I was about to clarify what I was saying about federal prosecution. The thing is that Zimmerman may not be the only defendant in a potential federal prosecution, and then again, he may not be a defendant, period. Another thing that was exposed is what appeared to be the constant, what we would see as perjury coming from some of the police officers involved in this case, and there's even concerns that the cops were in a buddy-buddy relationship with Zimmerman.
Now that's very interesting. So Michael, you're saying that arguably the police officers in Sanford, Florida, could be charged with a civil rights violation because they are protecting Trayvon Martin. That's your argument?
Not protecting Trayvon Martin, protecting George Zimmerman.
Protecting George Zimmerman. Excuse me. I meant protecting George Zimmerman. That's
exactly.
a very interesting thought. I want you to hold that thought. We're going to take another break. But when we come back, I hadn't heard this argument before, and I want you to embellish it a little bit. Folks, if you want to call in, you can join. Michael's doing a great job, but that doesn't mean you can't join in at 202-889-9797. This is Mark Levine. This is The Inside Scoop. We'll be right back right after this.
You're listening to WPWC We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Does your child have difficulty controlling their anger or a history of academic failure in school? Options Public Charter School offers a therapeutic learning environment with small classroom sizes and on-site counseling services to help students succeed. Options PCS is now enrolling grades 5 through 11 for the upcoming school year. For more information, call Options PCS today at 202-547-1028. Options Public Charter School. Exceptional education for exceptional students.
Take Action News with David Schuster, Saturdays from 12 to 3 on We Act Radio, 1480 AM, and weactradio.com.
Well, for me, it's always been, you report the facts. You report like hell, let the chips fall where they may. And the truth ultimately is what's going to sort of help our society and help all of us. I don't think progressives want a thumb on the scale on the facts. They just want the facts out there. You let the facts out, and progressives will tell you, we're going to win 70% of the time. You may quibble with the percentages or whatnot, but I think that's just sort of what progressives are looking for, and I think that's where this all sort of meshes with my interest as a journalist. And my interest as a journalist is report the facts. Here's what's going on. Here's what the facts say. Here's what history says. Here are the lessons we know we have learned. And let people draw their own conclusions. And I think what's so unfortunate right now in the world of broadcast media is I do think that a lot of conservative radio, certainly conservative television, they're not interested in facts. And that's ultimately where I think conservative media is going to have its downfalls, that Americans are hungry. They're just hungry for basic information, hungry for basic facts. You report like hell, you let the chips fall where they may. I think it's natural for all of us who care, who are passionate about politics, who feel like we have a sense about the difference between right and wrong. I think it's okay to let that be part of your coverage. It's important for all of us as broadcasters and journalists. In this day and age, we have to be authentic. You can't be the person who's up in the ivory tower that comes down and tells people, now you must eat your peas. No, it's all about, we all have personalities, and I think it's being aware sometimes of our own bias, but also being open to the idea that sometimes we're wrong, but we have a dialogue, and we have a passionate dialogue, and we care about this country, we care about this community, and I think that sort of passion is what carries us through.
Hear more from David Schuster, Saturdays from 12 to 3 on Take Action News on We Act Radio, 1480 AM, and weactradio.com.
You're listening to WPWC We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Mark Levine. You can follow me on Twitter at Mark Levine Talk or go to my website at marklevinetalk.com. talking about the Trayvon Martin, I should call it the George Zimmerman trial. But to me, I always think the victim should be memorialized more than the alleged killer. One of the reasons I love to have callers on a radio show is that many times my callers have more information than I do. That's certainly true with regard to the Trayvon Martin trial. I have watched some of it, but I'm sure not nearly as much as the person I have on the line, my favorite caller from the Bronx, Michael. So, Michael, you were telling me before the break that you think that the police may be involved in some kind of conspiracy to protect George Zimmerman?
Absolutely, because George Zimmerman was a frequent 911 caller, and they, according to reports, they have developed some kind of an acquaintance. Now, on the 19th...
Well, but this is a guy, but in the police defense, Zimmerman was a vigilante. He was a guy who was always looking for trouble, and I forget how many calls he made to the police reporting trouble. Just because he called the police a lot, that's not reason to blame the police.
But the police also have a history of double standards, racial discrimination, and not even protecting women for that matter.
These particular police, the Sanford police in Florida.
The Sanford police, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, they're not always knights in shining armor.
Well, not all police are. So what specifically do you know of a relationship between Zimmerman and the police that suggests the police might have been helping Zimmerman?
There is a concern, and it was brought up that one of the detectives or one of the police officers that was talking with Zimmerman played the 911 call in which in the background the screams for help were being heard. And the cop said to Zimmerman, is that you? That sounds like you.
Oh,
and then Zimmerman said, no, that doesn't sound like me. And then the cop supposedly said, trust me, that's you. Work with me on this.
Well, now this is very, very interesting. As I said before I even brought you on the line, Michael, I think the heart of this case may be which mother the jurors believe. And, of course, the jurors, many people know that it's 6. I don't like juries of 6. I like juries of 12. But it's 6 women, 5 of whom I understand are mothers themselves. And how powerful it is when the mother of Trayvon Martin gets up there and says, that screaming was my son. But equally powerful is the mother of George Zimmerman, who gets up on the stand and says, that screaming was my son.
Now,
If you have a tape, if what you're talking about is true, Michael, and there's a tape of a cop saying to him, was that you? And Zimmerman says it was not me. And the cop says, hey, I think it was you. That's very, very strong evidence against George Zimmerman. Is what you're talking? Where does your source come from for this? Is there a tape of this?
There was. I was listening on the radio. I can't remember exactly what program I was listening to because I listen to a bunch of progressive talk while I'm at work. Okay, but there was an audio somewhere in which the cop, I can't remember if it was a regular police officer or one of the detectives, that had said to Zimmerman, is that you screaming?
Michael, I want to ask you a favor, and that is that my Facebook page, the Mark Levine fan page on Facebook. You go there frequently. I appreciate your posts there. I'm going to give you a homework assignment before next week. My homework assignment is to find what you're talking about, find the audio, if you've got it, of the police suggesting to Zimmerman that it was his voice, particularly if you have evidence of Zimmerman saying it wasn't me. If you can find that, whether it be audio or writing, whatever you've got on it, if you could post it on my Facebook fan page, I promise you I'll bring it up next week, because that, to me, in and of itself is very powerful evidence of Zimmerman's
2 more things before I go.
Yeah.
Okay, first off, I don't know if this coroner had testified yet, because I know the prosecution wrapped up its case in chief. The defense is expected to be presenting their case this coming week, and then the prosecution will have a chance for rebuttal.
Right.
There is a coroner's report, and this coroner, who's also the person that dressed up Trayvon's body for funeral viewing and, the funeral services, he stated that nowhere on Trayvon's body was any DNA from George Zimmerman, and likewise there was no DNA from Trayvon Martin on George Zimmerman whatsoever, that there was no DNA exchange. But the key factor was that there was no DNA of George Zimmerman on anywhere on Trayvon's body or any of the clothes that he was wearing.
And let's talk about why that's relevant. If you're in a physical fight with someone, you might scratch someone on the arm or in the face or whatever, and if you do, their DNA gets under your fingernails. Now, of course, it's possible,
or on the clothes,
or on your clothes, right? I mean, if you, I mean, that's not going to happen with just bodily contact. But if you're in a fight, if someone's bleeding all over you, right, that blood will get on you. Of course, you can shoot someone from a distance, but it's very hard to have a physical. You can't have a physical fight from a distance. You really can't. And and I hope the coroner or whoever testifies will go one step further and say that it's unlikely in a physical altercation to not have some DNA transfer. Now, it could be, if it were cold out, this is Florida, remember, but if it were cold out, you could say, well, they had gloves on or they had coats on and there was no DNA exchange. But in Florida, I don't think that's an argument that's easy to be made, particularly when both men were wearing, I forget, I believe George Zimmerman had the gun in his undershorts, and I think Trayvon Martin was certainly not what was he wearing? Hoodie.
Let's put it this way. The temperature had to be in at least 60 degrees or 65 degrees. We're talking like good tropic weather.
So, but one thing I would think they would test, though, Michael, is not just on each other's body, but on each other's clothes. For example.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
All right. So, in other words, it's not just the body. In other words, you're saying not just the fingernails. No DNA from George Zimmerman was found on Trayvon Martin's hoodie, is what you're saying.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
That's
exactly.
powerful stuff.
So that's got to get established, and I'm thinking if that was not testified in the case in chief, that might be reserved for the rebuttal.
Well, I don't know. I don't know the prosecution's strategy here, but I do know this: you cannot, on rebuttal, bring up anything that wasn't brought up in the defense testimony.
Well, yeah.
So you have to be very careful about saving stuff, what they call sandbagging, for rebuttal, because if the defense doesn't make an argument that the rebuttal rebuts, the judge won't let you bring it in. So that's a very dangerous strategy if that's their strategy.
That is true. Now, the cries for help is where we get to the juicy part. Now, the major question is the voice on the 911 call in the background that's screaming for help, is that the voice of Trayvon or is that the voice of Zimmerman? I have figured it out, and I've come across with the use of logic and reasoning. Are you ready for this?
I don't know how you can possibly prove this with logic and reasoning when you don't know what either one sounds like when they're under distress, but I'm all ears, Michael. You go right ahead.
All right. I'm saying, no doubt in my mind, that voice was Trayvon calling for help.
How?
And here's the reason. George Zimmerman, we have heard his voice on a number of occasions in the videotape interviews, as well as entering his plea.
Yeah, but we haven't heard him crying and screaming. I mean, let's face it, you and I would both sound very different if we were crying and screaming than our ordinary conversation right here.
Well, pretty much, but it doesn't sound like a young boy. Now, here's the other part, that people were testifying that the screams for help was ongoing until the gunshots emerged. Only after the gunshots emerged did the screaming stop. All right? If George Zimmerman was the one screaming for help and he fired those shots towards Trayvon and he believes that he didn't do anything wrong, why didn't he scream for help further, saying, someone call 911, I had to take the unfortunate action of shooting somebody, and call for help, we could try to revive him. You never heard him utter any screams thereafter, and furthermore, the screams sound like a little boy, and it sounded like somebody that was unarmed and was at a total disadvantage. Remember, Zimmerman was the one that had the gun.
Right.
And he probably pulled it out. Trayvon probably saw the gun pulled out, and he screamed and Trayvon screaming for help, trying to run for cover. He knows his life is on the line. That sounds more like the kind of frightful scream than somebody getting beaten the daylights out of.
I mean, that's true. It does seem like someone who has a gun is much less likely to be the guy screaming. You think
That's
he'd pull?
exactly
He'd pull.
my
He'd think
point.
he'd pull the gun, and also if he's screaming, it would. I just can't imagine the sort of high-pitched death scream of someone truly in terror. It's hard to be truly in terror when you're carrying a gun.
It comes down to logic, reasoning, and simple common sense.
I'll tell you this.
Person, let me finish this.
Go ahead.
The person that is unarmed and has no way of truly defending themselves and feel that that may be this last second of their life, are the ones screaming for help. That I need help. Someone stop him. Blah blah blah. And then add to that, there's no DNA on Trayvon coming from George Zimmerman. I would say that it was Trayvon that was screaming for help, hoping for a miracle.
I'll tell you this, Michael. You make a very strong case. I think the prosecution needs to hire you as.
I hope they were listening and then maybe taking.
I think they need to hire you as someone helping them with their case, because you make a very, very powerful case for the guilt of George Zimmerman. And of course, we'll see what happens. I'm concerned. I'm nervous. I really hope that justice is done in this case. Thank you so much, Michael, for this extended phone call.
It's been a pleasure, and I guess in the words of television, to be continued.
To be continued, absolutely. Thank you again, Michael, for calling in. When we come back, I got a few closing thoughts on both the Voting Rights Act, marriage equality, and the immigration bill, where you're going to find I'm in surprising agreement with George Will. I don't agree with him often, but I do agree that $46 billion for border security is a joke. And we'll get to that. Those are my final comments when we come back. If you want to call in, there's still time to do so. 202-889-9797. 202-889-9797. This is Mark Levine. This is The Inside Scoop. This is We Act Radio, and we'll be right back right after this.
You're listening to WPWC We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
My name is Joe Thompson. I'm 29 years old and have a career that I love as a systems analyst. Career. It still sounds cool to say that word. I never could have gotten on this path without a college degree. And if the college me were here, he'd tell you.
I never would have gotten to college without Big Brothers Big Sisters. I could have ended up anywhere, on the streets even. But college? Joe Thompson? Not likely. My big brother helped me out. He taught me I could do anything, at a time when a lot of people were saying just the opposite.
And to a 7-year-old, that means a lot. My big brother's name is Phil. And Phil is the reason that this 7-year-old grows up to be a systems analyst.
Whether you donate money or time, you're helping Big Brothers Big Sisters help a child. And that can last a lifetime. Start something today at bigbrothersbigsisters.org. Brought to you by Big Brothers Big Sisters and the Ad Council.
Hello, this is Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and I want to tell you about my new favorite discovery, Yosemite National Park. I recently went there with my husband and children, and we walked the trails to see the breathtaking waterfalls, admired the grand meadows and giant sequoias. But the future of our national parks is uncertain. Many challenges face our parks today, from polluted air and water to development threats outside their borders and inadequate funding to protect our national heritage. That's why the National Parks Conservation Association recently completed a decade-long assessment of the challenges facing our national parks, along with proposed actions that will ensure our children and grandchildren will be able to enjoy the parks as we have. Our national parks have inspired Americans for nearly 100 years. As we approach the centennial of the National Park Service in 2016, please join us in helping to protect our national park legacy. Find out how at www.mpca.org.
You're listening to WPWC We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. Got just a few minutes left. This is Mark Levine. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my Twitter address is Mark Levine Talk. Just go and follow me at Mark Levine Talk, MarkLevineTalk. My website is marklevinetalk.com. Please don't get me confused with the conservative talk show host, Mark Levin, Levin. I don't agree with him on anything. I don't look like him. I don't talk like him. I assure you, I don't think like him. The E stands for empathy. That's something that conservatives have all too little of. So again, marklevinetalk.com, where you can hear this show and all my shows on We Act Radio, on my nationally syndicated broadcast, with Leslie Marshall on the Inside Scoop TV show, on the Raucous Caucus, on News Views, wherever I am, where I appear on TV, whether it's CNBC or Fox or CNN or Russian TV or Chinese TV, wherever it is, you can find anything I've done at marklevinetalk.com. Few comments left. I know I talked at length about the Supreme Court decisions last week. I won't repeat that, except to say that, remember, the Supreme Court is not usually the last word on constitutional law. Not only because, let's face it, one of the 5 conservative justices could die or resign from office, in which case President Obama could appoint a progressive judge and completely change where the Supreme Court is. Not just for that reason. When it comes to the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court struck down Section 4. They struck down the law that said that certain localities in the United States, those that had persistently racist voting laws, and in fact had a racist voting law at least within the last 10 years, because if you didn't for 10 years, you could get yourself removed from it. They struck it down, saying they had to get pre-clearance from the Justice Department before they wanted to do another racist voting law. And of course, Texas went right ahead within 2 hours after the decision to do their best to put in a discriminatory photo ID that had already been rejected by the Justice Department. Because let's face it, Texas doesn't want to let its Latinos vote. If they did and voted in the same numbers that white people did, Texas would quickly turn from a red state to a blue state. Because they don't want the Democrats to take power in Texas, they're going to do whatever they can to disenfranchise Latinas and other minorities. But the Supreme Court decision is not the last word here. Congress can pass a law that brings back the Voting Rights Act. Remember, the Supreme Court justices said that the formulas Congress used were old. And even though Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in 2006 with dozens of hearings and tens of thousands of pages of testimony, and even though that law was passed unanimously in the Senate, 98-0, including Alabama's senators, remember, this was Shelby, Alabama, that wanted to discriminate and brought this suit so they could discriminate. And even though it was passed by a large majority in the House, Supreme Court 5-4 struck it down. But the battle's not over. I think the answer is clear. If you don't single out the southern states, just simply say that every state or locality that wants to change its voting rights laws in ways that harm minorities gets under the pre-clearance procedure. Put them all in. Or just put in the part that says if you have had a racist issue in the last 10 years. Maybe if we don't single out the states, Congress can pass that law. Remember, they passed it virtually unanimously last time. So I want to hear the Republicans' excuse for why suddenly racism is over. Don't give up on the Voting Rights Act. We can continue to fight that battle. The same is true with marriage equality. The battle is not over. It is over, thank God, for residents, gay and lesbian residents of those lucky 13 states in D.C. If you live in California or Maryland or D.C. or Iowa or Minnesota or Washington State or any of the states in the Northeast, New York or the New England states, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, or Rhode Island, if you live in any of those 13 states, and I hope I named them all, Delaware too? Yes, Delaware. I think I named them all. If you live in any of those states, you're lucky. You're a gay and lesbian person. You get full and equal rights under state law and under federal law. But more than 2/3 of gay people still live in one of the 37 states that does not offer full equality under the law. And think about how difficult it is if you move, right? Straight people have the luxury of they live in New York and they get a good job in Miami. They can go right down to Florida and take that job. But if gay couples move from New York to Miami, their marriage is automatically dissolved. It's like the government forces you to have a divorce. And if you think that's complicated, imagine the law on that. It's unclear. This Supreme Court ruling is the beginning. It's by far the end. We do not know the results of people moving from state to state, whether states are forced to recognize other states' laws. This battle has yet to be fought, and that's why in every state of the United States that does not yet have marriage equality, from my home state of Virginia to Illinois, which just recently barely did not get a vote on marriage equality, to states that are around the corner like Oregon and Hawaii, this battle will continue. It is not over. And I think it's important to understand, particularly for a radio station called We Act Radio, that we have a role to play in this. Just like we have a role in advocating for a new Voting Rights Act that actually allows preclearance for all racist voting procedures, we have a role to play in all the 37 states that don't yet have marriage equality to bring equal protection to everyone. And finally, I have a word on the immigration bill. Many of you know the immigration bill passed the Senate. It got, I think, every Democratic vote, virtually all. There may have been one that did not, and did get a smattering of Republicans, about 14, maybe a third of the Republicans. And the reason the Republicans voted for that bill was, well, two reasons. One, I think many of them cynically want Latino votes. Clearly, they didn't support this bill back in the last election. They changed their views to try to get Latino votes. But also because they supported an added enforcement on the border. $46 billion is in the Senate bill to beef up our protection on the border. Now, as conservative columnist George Will points out, and excuse me for being surprised that I agree with George Will, according to the congressional authorities that have been looking at the results of this $46 billion bill, which is supposed to station a person every 2,000 feet along the border. That's 3 persons per mile along a 2,000-mile fence that includes really harsh patches of desert. I feel sorry for the border agent sent out in the middle of 100-degree heat in this global warming climate. Can you imagine 120 degrees in the New Mexico Mexican desert or the Arizona Mexican desert? But anyway, the $46 billion spent on this bill, George Will points out, is to increase the effectiveness at the border. So the obvious question is, what is our effectiveness at the border? How many people are we turning away? It turns out we are currently 84% effective. Did you know that? For every 100 Mexicans who want to be immigrants to the United States, 84 are turned away. About 5 out of 6. Pretty good rate. And how much, if we do this huge new border fence and spend $46 billion and put a person, 3 people every single mile in the middle of the desert, how much do we hope is our goal at best with this $46 billion fence? How many people do we expect to turn away? We expect it to go up from 84% effectiveness to 90% effectiveness. 1 in 10 will still get in. 6 points. 6% more will be deterred. Is it worth spending $46 billion to deter 6% of what, after all, are people, immigrants, who just want to live the American dream like our grandparents and our great-grandparents did? Is it worth it? I mean, I'm all for deporting the drug dealers and the criminals, but the vast majority of Mexican immigrants are just like our ancestors. They just want to live a better life. Imagine that same $46 billion focused on homelessness or poverty or education or climate change or any of another of host of whatever. Pick your favorite topic. I'd like to see it go to Planned Parenthood to help protect women, poor women, who are forced to have that awful choice of deciding whether to have the power to use birth control or have a child and really live in poverty for the rest of their lives. Wherever you want that money to go, it's much better spent than $46 billion on a border fence. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the Inside Scoop today. If you want to see the video of today, it'll be up on my website, marklevingtalk.com, by the end of the day, along with the audio of the show and the audio of all my shows, The Raucous Caucus, right here on We Act Radio, all of my TV appearances, my other radio appearances. It's all at marklevingtalk.com. Follow me on Twitter at Mark Levine Talk. Join the Mark Levine fan page on Facebook. Let me know what you thought of today's show and commenting on my website or Facebook or Twitter, on my Facebook, on my website, on Twitter, or anywhere else. I'd love to hear from you. This is Mark Levine. I hope you enjoyed the Inside Scoop, and I am signing off.